Nike is the world's most well-known and largest sportswear corporation. In a little more than 50 years, one man's goal of better shoes grew into a global enterprise worth more than $100 billion. Today, we're looking back to the beginnings of Nike to see how the magic happened and what the components were for their success. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe to receive more interesting and useful information. Phil Knight had just graduated from Stanford in 1962. As any business graduate will tell you, it's impossible to become an entrepreneur if you don't have any good ideas. But Phil did. Back in the university, he was a distance runner, and in one of his business lectures, he wrote a report suggesting the following proposal. Phil had observed how Japanese cameras had supplanted the dominating German cameras in the American market, and he wondered if Japanese shoes could do the same for Puma and Adidas, both of which were quite popular in America at that time. Phil became obsessed with this notion of importing Japanese shoes to the United States after finishing that paper and graduating. Of course, he didn't possess any Japanese running shoes, and the few he'd seen were brought to the United States by soldiers stationed in Japan during the post-war occupation. This lack of exposure, however, only served to encourage Phil that he had stumbled across a fantastic opportunity. He realized that in order to take advantage of it, he'd have to make contact with a Japanese corporation and negotiate the importation of their goods into America, both of which he'd never done before. But, as befitting the man who would later develop Nike, he just did it. In November 1962, he flew to Japan as a tourist and began exploring. In the lovely city of Kobe, he came into a shoe store that piqued his interest. It belonged to a firm named Onitsuka Tiger, and the shoes they created were of exceptional quality. So much so that Phil was desperate to bring them back home. He posed as an American shoe distributor and set up a meeting with the company's founder. Phil made up a company made on the fly and volunteered to become Onitsuka's distributor in the America, which the owner, to his astonishment, accepted. Phil had become the official distributor for Onitsuka Tiger in the United States with nothing more than his confidence. In 1963, he received his first supply of 12 pairs of Tiger shoes and began selling them out of the back of his automobile at a running truck he could get into. Obviously, his strategy wasn't scalable, so he turned to the only guy he knew who knew more about shoes than he did, Bill Bowerman, his former coach at the University of Oregon. Bill was easily one of the most well-known instructors in America at that time, having guided several Olympic athletes. He was so taken with the Tiger sneakers that he wanted to collaborate. Thus, in January 1964, Bill and Phil formed Blue Ribbon Sports, investing $500 apiece. They spent it all on their first order, which totaled 300 pairs of shoes at $3.33 each. The shipment arrived in April 1964, and because to Bill's contacts, it was completely sold out by July. BRS sold $8,000 in shoes in their first year, and with that money, Phil began hiring salespeople for his company. Their revenue climbed to $20,000 by 1965, and they soon launched their own store in Santa Monica. But while Phil was in charge of the business side of things, Bill was one of who was actually innovating. He was the man who single-handedly introduced jogging in the United States. He wrote a book about it in 1966 that sold over 1 million copies, and his company was among the first to manufacture Tiger shoes for jogging. Bowerman was passionate about innovation, and with each new shipment from Onitsuka, he'd break up a few shoes to examine how they were produced, and he'd always strive to enhance them by adding cushioning or using lighter materials, for example. He'd been sending notes to Japan all the time, seeking improvements. He was practically creating Onitsuka's shoes for them. One of Bill's creations launched BRS into the mainstream. The Cortez, as he dubbed it, became one of the best-selling shoes in 1968, presumably due to the 1968 Olympics, which were held in Mexico. In 1969, BRS sold $300,000 worth of shoes thanks to the Cortez. But they had a major issue. The Cortez was so popular that they couldn't keep up with the demand. Every fresh cargo they got sold out faster than the previous one, but Onitsuka continued to send them at the same glacial rate. Onitsuka was actually satisfying local demand in Japan first, then sending whatever was left to America. Phil and Bill realized that in order to grow, they need to go beyond being a simple distributor. Then they realized they had the upper hand. The Cortez was Bowerman's design, so as soon as their contract with Onitsuka expired, they were free to begin producing it for themselves. Fortunately for them, their contract would expire in 1972, just before the Munich Olympics. As a result, Phil had plenty of time to plan his big move. In 1971, he began working on branding, and his first employee recommended naming the company Nike, after the Greek goddess of victory. Then Phil realized he needed a logo, so he went to a nearby university, grabbed the first graphic designer student he could find, and asked her to create one for him. He received the swoosh for the princely amount of $35. In retrospect, that was money wisely spent, and Phil was now fully prepared for the Olympics. Instead of entering into exclusive agreements, Phil built a network of subcontractors throughout Japan this time. Phil could finally expand his wings now that he has in charge of production. This graph of Nike's sales shows exactly when Phil began importing shoes from his Japanese subcontractors, and sure, he began before his contract even expired in 1971. Nike's story became one of the development from the point forward. In 1989, they became the leading sportswear company in America, thanks to clever marketing such as the Just Do It campaign, and by signing rookie athletes who would soon become famous all over the world. Thank you for spending time with us. We'll see you in our future video.